Good morning, scholars. Happy Wednesday and welcome to another day in math class. In today's lesson, lesson 10, we're going to continue our conversation over quadrilaterals and their characteristics. Except today, we're going to be learning about how to sort them into a hierarchy. A hierarchy just means a system of organization. And in that system of organization today, we'll learn how one quadrilateral can actually be multiple quadrilaterals at the same time, and some quadrilaterals cannot be other quadrilaterals too. So this will make more sense as we start to get into our lesson. For today, I'd like you to follow along with page 39 on your packet. Page 39 is going to be the page of notes that we need for today's lesson. So I will go over how to complete this page, and I'd like you to take the notes along with me. If you're stuck at any point during today's class, and I'm talking about the different kinds of quadrilaterals and their characteristics, and you're having a hard time remembering those characteristics, you can always go back to page 14 as we're doing the notes on page 39. All right, let's begin. What you see on the screen right now is the top of your page 39, where it says hierarchy of quadrilaterals. The trickiest concept when we're talking about quadrilaterals is the idea that one shape can actually have multiple names that are actually different kinds of quadrilaterals. And that's exactly what we're going to see in today's lesson. We'll have a shape, and instead of saying that this shape is just this kind of quadrilateral, we can actually give it multiple names. Let's start with example 1, which is the image that you see right here. So there are 3 hints here that help us determine the 3 different names we can give to this shape. And let's start with the first one. This shape has 4 sides. This makes it a, what do you think? It makes it a quadrilateral. The reason it's a quadrilateral is because quad in quadrilateral means 4. It has 4 sides. Next one. This shape has 2 pairs of parallel sides. What does this make it? 2 pairs of parallel sides. It makes it a parallelogram. Remember from a few lessons ago I told you a good way to remember that 2 pairs of parallel sides, parallelogram. The parallel is in the word parallelogram. Our last one. This shape has 4 congruent sides. This makes it a blank. This one's a little bit tricky. 4 congruent sides. Congruent means equal. There are 2 shapes in our quadrilateral groups that have 4 equal sides. It's a rhombus and a square. But this one is not a rhombus and a square. It's one or the other. So which is it? I'm noticing that this shape here does not look like it has 90-degree angles like a square would. This one is a little bit slanted over, giving it some acute angles and some obtuse angles. So this is actually not a square. It would instead be a rhombus. So what this means within a hierarchy is that this figure is a quadrilateral, a parallelogram, and a rhombus all at the same time, because the figure has characteristics of a quadrilateral, a parallelogram, and a rhombus. Let's do example 2. Remember from earlier in the video I had mentioned that if you're having a hard time thinking of the names to these figures based on the explanations that are given, page 14 in your packet has descriptions of each quadrilateral that you can use. Alright, let's begin with example 2. This shape has 4 sides, so it is also a quadrilateral. Remember, 4 sides, quadrilateral. This shape has 2 pairs of parallel sides, so it is also a parallelogram. 2 pairs of parallel sides, parallelogram. Our last one. This shape has 4 right angles. This makes it a blank. Let's think about what quadrilaterals have 4 right angles. There are only 2 of them, a square and a rectangle. Now a square has 4 equal sides, like we just said in the previous example, but this one here doesn't look like it has 4 equal sides. So instead of a square, the answer to this hint here, the shape has 4 right angles, is a rectangle. So when you look at this figure, we might be tempted to automatically say, oh, that's a rectangle. It looks just like a rectangle. What I'm pushing you to understand here is that it is not just a rectangle. It is three things at the same time, right? It's a quadrilateral, a parallelogram, and a rectangle. We're expanding those geometric names that we use to describe figures today. Let's do number 3. Geometric properties also help us determine names a shape does not have. For example, the shape in example 2 does not have 4 congruent sides, so it is not a blank or a blank. Now this figure up here is example 2's figure. And this problem is telling us that because example 2 doesn't have 4 equal sides, it can't be 2 kinds of quadrilaterals. And those 2 quadrilaterals are the only 2 that have 4 congruent sides. Congruent means equal. What are the names of those 2 quadrilaterals? A rhombus and a square. And because example 2 cannot be a rhombus or a square, right? It doesn't have 4 equal sides. That's how we came to the conclusion that it was a rectangle, in addition to other quadrilateral names as well. Example number 4. Which of the shapes below is a rhombus and why? Let's start with the definition of a rhombus. What is the definition of a rhombus? The definition of a rhombus is a 4-sided figure, and 4 of those sides are congruent. They are equal to each other. I also know that a rhombus cannot be example A, right? Because example A does not have 4 equal sides. Example B, one side over here is equal to the bottom side here, and the lateral side here, the vertical line, is equal to this one here. But a rhombus has all 4 sides that are the same. B does not fit that criteria, so it can't be B. Let's look at C. At first glance, C looks like a square. But remember, in this lesson, we're learning about how shapes can be multiple names. In addition to a square, can it be a rhombus? I don't know. Let's see. It looks like the 4 sides are equal, each side here. So far it's our best bet. Let me look at D real quick just to make sure I've counted all my options. D looks like a parallelogram, right? It looks like a rectangle that's kind of been shifted over to the side. So it can't really be D. And that leaves C as our option. C is a rhombus. And the reason it's a rhombus is because it has 4 congruent sides. C can also be a square. And this example shows you how one shape can have multiple names. It can be a rhombus and a square. We finished page 39, and so right now we're going to move on to page 40. It's our last page of notes. Again, remember, if you're stuck, page 14 is there to always help you with the notes about the definitions and characteristics for each quadrilateral that we're talking about. Let's get started with problem 1, mystery shape number 1. These problems here are a little bit different from the ones we did. Here you have a word bank to the top right, and what you're supposed to do is use one of these words in the blanks at the bottom. One of them you will not use, and we'll figure out which that one is at the end. Let's start with the first one. This shape has 4 sides. This makes it a blank. A 4-sided figure is called a quadrilateral. Good. The second one, this shape has 2 pairs of parallel sides. This makes it a blank. Going up to the word bank, I can't use quadrilateral because I already used it. I can't use trapezoid because a trapezoid only has 1 pair of parallel sides. I can only use parallelogram, square, rectangle, and rhombus. So you'll notice that all 4 of them actually have 2 pairs of parallel sides, but I can only pick one. And the best option that I can pick now is a parallelogram, 2 pairs of parallel sides. The third one, this shape has 4 congruent sides. This makes it a blank. My remaining options are trapezoid, rhombus, rectangle, and square. Can't use trapezoid because the trapezoid doesn't have 4 congruent sides. Can't use rectangle because a rectangle doesn't have 4 congruent sides, right? So I can only use rhombus or square. Before figuring out which one I'm going to use, I'm actually going to read the next hint. This shape has 4 right angles. So moving forward for the 4 right angles, I know I'm going to use rectangle or square because those are the ones that have 4 right angles. I can't use rhombus for that one. So rhombus is actually a better option for the third hint where it says 4 congruent sides. So I'm going to put rhombus right there. Remember, you can't repeat them. You could put a square here and it would be equally as correct, but the reason I'm using rhombus is because I don't want to repeat any quadrilateral names. So the next one, the shape has 4 right angles. Remember I said we can only use rectangle or square here. And before figuring out which one I'm going to do, I'm actually going to read the next one again. This shape has 4 right angles and 4 congruent sides. The fact that for the last one I'm looking for right angles and congruent sides tells me that that's going to be a square, which means I can't use a square in this top one here. This top one for 4 right angles is going to be a rectangle. That way I can save square for the very last question. Remember, the goal here is to use as many characteristics as you can for a given name and try to figure out which one best fits without repeating the name of any quadrilateral. You know, these ones are a little bit trickier. We'll do a second one together, mystery shape number 2. This time, I actually don't have the word banks. We're going to have to think in our heads what they are. If you're having a hard time remembering those words, remember page 14 has those vocab words for you. So let's start with the first hint. This shape has 4 sides. This makes it a quadrilateral. Good. The shape has 1 pair of parallel sides. We only have one name for a figure that has 1 pair of parallel sides. It is called a... If you said trapezoid, you're correct. This shape does not have 2 sets of parallel sides, so it's not a blank. So what you can put here, honestly, is really any figure that does not have, or any figure, I'm sorry, that has 2 sets of parallel lines, because we know that this is not that. So on here, I'm actually going to put a parallelogram, because I know a parallelogram has 2 sets of parallel sides. Other options you could have put here could have been a rectangle, 2 sets of parallel sides, a square, 2 sets of parallel sides. Oh, I'm sorry, you could not have put a square. A square has all congruent sides, but a rectangle could have worked just as well. And our last one here, this shape does not have 4 right angles, so it's not a rectangle or a square. Rectangles and squares have 4 right angles. And that's why I put that one there, because we know that this trapezoid is not a rectangle or a square, given the right angle property. Let's go over number 3 and number 4, the last 2 on that page. Number 3 says, which of these shapes is not a parallelogram and why? Before looking at these shapes, first let's think about the properties of a parallelogram. What makes a parallelogram a parallelogram? Parallelograms have 2 sets of parallel lines. And because I'm looking for the shape that is not a parallelogram, I'm looking for the shape that does not have 2 sets of parallel lines. So I'm going to start with A. Looking at this line here, this vertical line, compared to this line, this looks like they are not parallel, because if I extended this line all the way up, it would eventually touch this line, if I were to extend that one too. Looking at this top line here from A and this bottom line here, these two are parallel to each other. They won't touch if I extend them. So A so far only has 1 set of parallel lines. It does not have 2 sets. A kind of fits what we're looking for, but before picking that, I have to look at the other options too. Looking at B, this line here is parallel to this one, and this one is parallel to this one. So there are 2 sets of parallel lines here. It's a parallelogram. It's actually a rectangle. Looking at C, it's the same thing. These 2 are parallel to each other. These 2 are parallel to each other. 2 sets of parallel lines. It's a parallelogram. Also a square. Not what I'm looking for. D is a little bit tricky. D, at first glance, you might think looks like a kite, but it's actually a diamond shape. It's a rhombus that has been sort of twisted over onto its side. So if this line here, let's start here. If I were to extend this line all the way up, and I were to extend this line all the way up as well, they would never touch. So this line here is parallel to this one. Same thing down here. This one is parallel to this one as well. So it is a parallelogram, and I can't really pick that. So the only option that I have so far that is not a parallelogram is A. A is actually a trapezoid because it has one set of parallel lines, not two. Number 4, true or false? All squares are rectangles. Explain your reasoning. I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about this one. It's a little bit tricky too. Think of the properties of a rectangle and whether or not a square fits that definition as well. So the definition of a rectangle is a quadrilateral 4 sides that has 4 right angles. A square has 4 sides and it has 4 right angles as well. So this is actually true. All squares do qualify as rectangles because they have 4 right angles. I know some of you are thinking, hold on, that makes no sense because rectangles don't have congruent sides and squares do have congruent sides. And that's true. But squares are rectangles simply because of the fact that they share the same right angles that rectangles do. Squares are a special kind of rectangle. But because rectangles don't have congruent sides like squares do, rectangles are not squares. So it doesn't work backwards. Squares are rectangles because of the right angles. They have that in common. But rectangles are not squares because they don't have the congruent sides, the equal sides, like squares do. This comparison of one quadrilateral to another one is something that takes a little bit of practice to get used to, and that's actually going to be the focus of tomorrow's lesson and Friday's lesson as well. So we're going to keep practicing that concept a little bit more. Before I jump into what your independent practice is, I'd like to go over the concept of using many terms to describe the same shape. So here it says, which of these terms can be used to describe the polygon below? This is a polygon here. It just means a figure. So there's more than one answer. And what you're doing here is figuring out which of the definitions of these terms can be used to describe this. This is what we did on page 39. Let's go step by step. Quadrilateral means 4-sided figure. This has 4 sides, checks out. Parallelogram means 2 sets of parallel lines. This line is parallel to this one. This line is parallel to this one. Checks out. I can use parallelogram to describe it too. Rectangle means that it should have 90-degree angles. I don't see any 90-degree angles here. So we can't use a rectangle to describe it. Let me actually use my pen feature as we're doing this, so I can cross out the ones that don't apply. Square, can't use a square because I also don't see any 90-degree angles. Rhombus, rhombus would mean that the sides would be congruent. Remember, a rhombus is like a square, but it's kind of been slanted over to the side. So I can't use a rhombus either. Trapezoid is a 4-sided figure that has only one set of parallel lines. But when we were talking about the parallelogram in B, we said that it is a parallelogram because it has 2 sets of parallel lines. So it can't be a trapezoid. So the only 2 terms that we can use to describe this polygon or this figure is a quadrilateral and a parallelogram. It is both of those things at the same time. Let's do another one. Which of these terms can be used to describe the polygon below? Take a few seconds and think about it. All right, I'm going to go over this one. If you need some extra time, feel free to pause the video. I'm going to start with A, quadrilateral. The figure has 4 sides, so A could work. I'm trying to make that into a check mark. B, parallelogram. Parallelogram means that it has two sets of parallel lines. But here, I really only see one set of parallel lines. The top line here, the horizontal one, and the bottom horizontal line. So I cannot use parallelogram to describe it. Rectangle. Rectangle would be four-sided figure with 90-degree angles. Can't use a rectangle here. I don't see any 90-degree angles at all. I would need perpendicular lines for that. I can't use a square either because I certainly don't see congruent sides and I don't see 90-degree angles. Let's think about a rhombus. A rhombus is a square, but it's sort of slanted over in a way that it doesn't have 90-degree angles, but all the sides are congruent. I don't see any of that here. Trapezoid. A trapezoid is a figure that has only one set of parallel lines. And in this figure, I see only one set of parallel lines. So the two terms that I can use to describe this polygon, this figure, is a quadrilateral and a trapezoid. It is both things at the same time. All right, let's do one last one. Which of these terms can be used to describe the polygon below? I will warn you on this one. I know at first glance you might want to say, oh, that is definitely a square. And that might be true, but there are several terms that you can use to describe this polygon. I'm going to give you a few seconds. Try to figure out what those terms are before we go over it. All right, let us start with A, quadrilateral. Do I see four sides? I do, so quadrilateral would work. Parallelogram, two sets of parallel lines. I see one set here, second set here. I see two sets total. So parallelogram could work, quadrilateral could work. Rectangle. A rectangle is a four-sided figure, 90-degree angles. I see a 90-degree angle here, another one here, another one here, another one here. Remember, these are perpendicular lines that are coming together to make that 90-degree angle all the way around. So a rectangle could work. So far we have 3 for 3. I have a quadrilateral, parallelogram, rectangle. Square. A square has 90-degree angles and all four sides are congruent. They're equal. All of these four sides look pretty congruent to me. Granted, the way to be most precise about this is by measuring these, but we're a little bit limited with our supplies, or with our resources. So, looking at these, they are a square. A rhombus is a four-sided figure and all congruent sides. I know a rhombus doesn't have 90-degree angles, but the definition of a rhombus is four-sided figure, four congruent sides. So I still do see that here. I see four sides and I see congruent sides, regardless of what the angles are. A trapezoid is a four-sided figure with only one set of parallel lines. And that is the only definition so far that doesn't fit this polygon, because I see two sets of parallel lines, not one set of parallel lines. So all of these options, all 5 of them, could be used to describe the square to the right. So a square is actually a pretty broad term. We're used to looking at a figure just like this and saying, oh, that's definitely a square. But in geometry, the word square is much bigger. There are a lot of definitions that can fit into square. It's a quadrilateral, a parallelogram, a rectangle, and a rhombus, and a square, all at the same time. And that's what we're doing today. We're expanding, we're broadening those definitions that we have for different figures. Your Wednesday independent practice is page 41 to page 43. You're doing the exact same thing that we did in this video, and at any point if you're stuck, you can rewind the video and watch how I went through those mystery shapes to figure out what we're talking about and how I was able to figure out the hierarchy of these figures, the different names that we can use to describe the same thing. Remember, if you're stuck, please feel free to call me and text me, and I'd be more than happy to help you. All right? Stay tuned for tomorrow's video. Bye, scholars. Your Wednesday independent practice is page 41 to page 43. You're doing the exact same thing that we did in this video, and at any point if you're stuck, you can rewind the video and watch how I went through those mystery shapes to figure out what we're talking about, and how I was able to figure out the hierarchy of these figures, the different names that we can use to describe the same thing. Remember, if you're stuck, please feel free to call me and text me, and I'd be more than happy to help you. All right? Stay tuned for tomorrow's video. Bye, scholars.